Hi, my name is Brandon, and I'm an alcoholic and addict in recovery. When I first started the 12 steps, I assumed that there was just one way to do that work, and there was just one way for a sponsor to present it to someone. And then I started talking to friends, and their sponsors were doing things a little different with them, which made me wonder, well, is my sponsor not doing it correctly? Is their sponsor not doing it correctly? And I was quickly reassured that there are different approaches to the way that we do the 12 steps. There are certain parts of it that are important in any 12-step process, and I'll talk about those in a second. But what I learned was that different sponsors have different approaches, just like in AA and any of the 12-step programs in general. Different people have different approaches to the way they work the programs in their lives. I want to read some about that today because it's very important to understand. A lot of people get turned off of programs like AA because they might go to a meeting and hear someone say something that they don't care for, or they hear someone talk about their recovery, and they think that's not the way I want to handle my recovery. And it's important to understand that there is room for different ways of handling your recovery in these programs. So I'm going to read some of what Tommy Rosen has to say about it in Recovery 2.0, because he puts it a lot better than I ever could. He says, there are an infinite number of approaches to the 12 steps that will work. Some ingredients are required: honesty, willingness, open-mindedness, and a desire to learn and grow. But as long as these are in place, the steps allow for a lot of interpretation. And these interpretations are played out every day as sponsor and sponsee sit opposite each other to go through the work involved in the steps. Think of the 12 steps as one doctrine of a spiritual path of recovery from addiction. As happens with all religions and spiritual paths, a congregation gathers around the doctrine. In this case, the congregation is varied, both in terms of the backgrounds of its constituency and the individual approaches to it. In Judaism, there are the Orthodox, who have their beliefs about life and what it means to be Jewish. There are conservative Jews with different ideas, and there are Reformed Jews with still other ideas. 3 groups, 3 different approaches to Judaism. Within each group are subgroups, sects, factions, families, and individuals whose ideas vary from one to the next, yet they all consider themselves Jewish. They have access in most cases to the same doctrine and texts. All of them, from the most orthodox to the most reformed, have their own unique paths through their religion. How do they navigate? They navigate according to their teachers. The same is basically true for the 12 steps. I feel like that's very important because it is really easy to go into a meeting and hear someone talk about the work that they're doing in a program and get turned off because they're either too strict about what they're doing or they're too loose about what they're doing. They fall into one of these categories that we don't identify with. And that's why it's important to recognize that there are different ways to work the program, as long as some of these core principles like honesty, willingness, open-mindedness, and a desire to learn and grow, as long as these are in place, then there is room to move. That's why when picking a sponsor, it's important to look for somebody who has what you want. And often the advice that we give to people to pick sponsors is go to meetings. And when you find someone who really speaks to you, who really says, when they talk, you think this person gets me, or I get this person, that's the kind of person you should ask about sponsorship. And I found my sponsor at a Drug Addicts Anonymous meeting. And this gentleman was speaking that, and he was the speaker for that night. And as he spoke, we had very different backgrounds. We came from very different parts of the country. But as he spoke, there was just something that drew me to him. A lot of what he was saying made sense to me. A lot of his ideas about a higher power. He didn't necessarily believe in a religious higher power. That made a lot of sense to me. Because when I came into AA, I thought that I was required to believe in a religious higher power. I didn't understand that the requirement is a spiritual higher power. And my sponsor really spoke to the difference between those two things. And that really attracted me to him. When I went up to him after the meeting, which took a lot of guts on my part, I was extremely nervous to go to someone, go to a stranger and basically say, "Hey, will you be my friend?" When I did that, it just felt right from the first meeting. He and I clicked. We went through all of the steps together. And he brought me up in his way of doing the 12 steps, which was the way that he was taught to do the 12 steps. And it's slightly different than some of my friend sponsors and the way they were taught to do it. And if you look at my daily practice of how I practice the 12 steps, it probably differs slightly from my sponsors, because we all end up with our own individual ways of doing things as we start to figure out what works within our individual lives and how do we incorporate what we've learned into the lives we have. And that's the beautiful thing about the program, is that because I have a specific way that I work the program, then other people are, when they hear me speak, they may say, "Hey, that guy makes a lot of sense to me." And that's the way this stuff is passed down from person to person. And that's the other beautiful thing about sponsorship and about the AA program, about 12-step programs in general, is the way that this is passed along from person to person. So it doesn't mean there's not good or bad approaches. There can be. There certainly can be, but the important thing to remember is that there are very different ways of approaching things. And when you hear someone, the best advice that I can give is when you hear someone in a meeting who is talking about the steps in a way you disagree with, take a cue from your disagreement and try to open your mind a little bit. It's okay to disagree, but just try to open your mind. Try not to let your disagreement close you off to hearing what they're trying to say. Try not to let your disagreement close you off to empathizing with that person. Keep your mind open. Listen to what they have to say. Most importantly, make space for them, not only in the conversation, but in your own head. Make some space for them. So, because whether or not you agree with that idea is important to them. And one of the important things about the 12 steps is acknowledging that everybody has their own experience, their own story to tell, and that all those stories are important. So the different ways that we work the program, if you hear somebody say there's one right way to work the program, be cautious of those people. The other thing is that you got to recognize that sometimes you have to change the way you work the program as time goes on. You may find that what worked for you the first year of sobriety isn't working quite so well as you progress. And so you got to be willing to iterate, change things. And when you feel like things aren't quite working the way they used to, that's the time when you got to call that sponsor back up again and say, "Hey, got any advice for me?" So that's it for today. I'll be back tomorrow with more. Have a good one.